For 9 years in this company, my silence was filed as compliance, my precision was recast as support work, and tonight, in the one room where governance becomes history, they called me ornamental. I learned early that institutions have two ledgers, the official one with signatures and policy numbers, and the unofficial one written in who is interrupted, who is credited, who is told to wait by men who have never read the language they enforce. Mine had been a career built in that second ledger, line by line, correction by correction, the steady labour of preventing damage that would later be described as someone else's strategic foresight. My name is Taylor Bennett, and by the time the emergency board vote opened under fluorescent glare in Calder Strategic Systems' glass and brass conference hall, I already knew the night would be entered twice, once in the minutes, once in memory. And only one of those records would tell the truth unless I held the line myself. The hall was designed to intimidate politely. Brass inlays tracked geometric paths across pale marble. The glass walls held a reflected city that looked cleaner than it was. A polished walnut table, long enough to stage a small war, curved into a horseshoe around the voting arc where directors sat with embossed agenda packets, aligned to the same angle, each packet sealed with a compliance strip that had to be broken on camera. Above the far wall, the live recording light burned red, unwavering, while two compliance officers checked microphones and timestamp sync like flight crew, preparing for a difficult landing. It was 6:42 p.m. when I stepped in, and the room had already arranged itself into rank, directors at centre, division heads one tier back, legal to the right, audit to the left, observers along the rear perimeter. My nameplate was not where it had been in every prior governance crisis. It had been moved from the voting arc to a narrow side credenza beside legal interns and guest counsel binders, as if my role had shifted from architect to spectator without notice, without vote, without even the courtesy of formal explanation. I didn't ask the room to explain itself. I took the back seat they had assigned me, set my notebook square to the table edge, uncapped my pen, and wrote the minute mark in the top corner. Restraint had stopped being fear years ago. It had become evidence discipline. People who perform dominance count on visible reaction because reaction can be translated into instability, and instability can be excluded as procedural noise. I had no intention of supplying noise. The packet in front of me was an observer copy, missing the annex pages on contingency authority and certification threshold. That omission, too, was deliberate. I had drafted 3 earlier versions of those annex protocols under outside counsel supervision during the proxy war years, and I recognized missing language by wait alone. Paper tells on people when they are trying to hide intent. Victor Hale entered without hurry, carrying no documents, flanked by 2 directors who had repeated his talking points for so long they spoke in his cadence, even when he was not in the room. He wore authority like a tailored garment, expensive, habitual, and maintained by staff he did not acknowledge. At the head position, he paused long enough to survey attendance as though he were granting admission in real time, then took his seat and tapped the table once. Conversations flattened. The microphones opened with a soft click. "Emergency session of the Calder Strategic Systems Board is now called," he said, voice amplified through ceiling speakers tuned just bright enough to sharpen consonants. He looked down the arc, then toward the back wall where I sat. "Observer attendance is noted. Voting participants only will address motions." It was not yet the line I knew he wanted, but it set the stage. Victor preferred exclusion by increments. First redefine the room, then redefine who belongs in it, then make that redefinition sound like ordinary housekeeping. One of the younger vice presidents, promoted 6 months earlier after presenting slides I had rebuilt the night before his committee review, shifted in his chair and avoided my eye. Another director, who had once asked me privately to explain fiduciary duty distinctions before a regulator call, stared at her packet as if the paper required full concentration. No one challenged the framing. Silence was the currency in this building. Everyone spent it to buy proximity to power. His opening remarks moved through scripted concern. Market volatility, activist pressure, leadership continuity. The language was urgent but deliberately unspecific, the kind that creates emotional momentum while concealing where authority is about to be concentrated. He proposed an emergency authority resolution for temporary operational stabilization, then assigned floor sequence without opening preliminary standing confirmations. That breach was small enough to pass if no one flagged it, and large enough to contaminate certification if someone did. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had been practicing this maneuver for years in less visible rooms, committee chairs, compensation subgroups, ad hoc advisories where minutes were thin and memory was negotiable. When I raised my hand to request recognition on standing before motion entry, he did not look at me. He called on audit instead. I kept my hand raised through the audit director's report, through the first legal risk summary, through an investor relations note that repeated external talking points while bypassing the internal controls matrix entirely. Finally, as if acknowledging a persistent noise near the window, Victor turned his head. "Taylor," he said. Not Ms. Bennett, not Director Bennett, just the first name he used when he wanted to make me appear junior in front of witnesses. "You have no standing here. Observe, don't participate." He gestured with 2 fingers toward the back row, almost casual, almost bored. "Security verified the list at entry. Let us keep this efficient." The words landed exactly as intended. Public diminishment framed as process. I heard one chair scrape softly against stone. Someone near legal inhaled and held it. The red recording light remained unchanged, catching every syllable for the official archive that would later be circulated as neutral text stripped of temperature, stripped of gaze, stripped of the way humiliation can be administered with a procedural tone. I felt my pulse rise, then stabilize, not because I was calm in any sentimental sense, but because training takes over when stakes sharpen. I had spent nights drafting risk pathways for scenarios where a single undefined term could transfer millions in liability. I knew what mattered here was not rebuttal volume. It was sequence, citation, preservation. 9 years earlier, during the hostile acquisition attempt that nearly broke the company, I had been 32, recently transferred from compliance analytics into governance support, a title chosen specifically to sound auxiliary. Outside counsel had arrived with rolling cases, war room clocks, and the expression of attorneys who bill by the emergency and trust no one until proven useful. They requested continuity maps, authority ladders, and decision failure contingencies within 48 hours. The executives gave speeches about resilience. I built the architecture that kept signatures valid when officers were unavailable, that prevented circular approvals, that triggered independent review when chair and CEO powers converged under stress. Section by section, I wrote language that assumed bad faith would one day wear a familiar face. The language was adopted, ratified, and then gradually absorbed into institutional practice, which in Victor's telling meant the system had always been obvious and his leadership had always been decisive. Attribution evaporated. My name remained in draft metadata and nowhere that mattered socially. By the second week after ratification, I understood the pattern that would define my years under him. After I prepared investor briefing books, he excluded me from photos and introduced junior men as strategic leads. After I trained those same men on governance triggers, he told committee guests I was excellent with details, the corporate equivalent of being thanked for arranging flowers at a policy funeral. When budget pressure hit, he preserved public-facing teams and cut my staff by attrition, then praised my adaptability when I absorbed 3 roles without error. Every diminishment was deniable on its own. Together they formed a structure, keep her useful, keep her uncredited, keep her visible enough to exploit and peripheral enough to silence. Tonight was the cleanest version of that structure I had ever seen. Security had verified attendee status only when I approached the director table, though I had attended every emergency governance meeting for 3 years and authored half the briefing language in the packets now opened before them. My full packet had been replaced with an observer set. My nameplate had been relocated. My request for standing recognition had been bypassed. Then came the line, delivered on record, with witnesses and microphones and plausible deniability preloaded into tone. Observe, don't participate. Victor believed process belonged to whoever performed certainty at the head of the table. He mistook choreography for law. I wrote his sentence verbatim in my notebook and marked the time to the second. Around me the room resumed movement, but slower now, as if everyone sensed a pressure shift they did not want to acknowledge. The compliance officer nearest the wall glanced once at the digital timer and then at me, a quick, unreadable look that said he knew enough to be uneasy and not enough to intervene. On the far side, corporate counsel Adrian Cho remained still, hands folded over a closed folder, expression professionally neutral. Adrian had that particular legal discipline that reveals nothing until asked directly. He had not spoken yet. Neither had I. Victor moved to call for preliminary assent on emergency authority parameters, bypassing another standing checkpoint in the process. The directors lifted their pens. The microphones captured paper, breath, fabric. I could feel the old temptation, the employable reflex to absorb the slight, preserve the institution, clean the spill quietly, and let men who preferred theatre call it leadership in the morning. That reflex had paid my mortgage, protected my team, kept my badge active through 3 restructures. It had also cost me piece after piece of my own name until colleagues who used my work daily could say, with straight faces, that I had no standing in the room I helped design. Silence wasn't peace. It was surrender billed as professionalism. I closed my observer packet, placed both hands on the table, and listened to the hum of the recording system as if it were a metronome. If they wanted this done by procedure, then procedure would be the blade, not the shield. I did not need his permission to belong to the record. I needed one clean opening, one uncontestable citation, one witness willing to read what had already been ratified. That opening was coming. I could feel it in the way people stopped meeting Victor's eyes and started scanning their documents for certainty he had never earned. My name is Taylor Bennett, and the night they tried to convert me into furniture was the night I chose to become text they could not edit. Victor lifted his chin toward the corporate secretary and said, "Proceed to preliminary ballot intake," as if my name had not just been removed from the category of person. Pens moved across cardstock in controlled strokes, and the room answered him with institutional obedience, paper rustle, muted throat clearing, the thin scrape of a chair adjusted by someone who wanted to look occupied rather than complicit. I watched Director Elaine Mercer slide her ballot halfway under her packet, hesitate, then push it forward anyway. On the far side of the horseshoe, Raj Patel kept his gaze on the compliance screen, jaw working once at the hinge. No one asked why a standing challenge had been denied without citation. No one asked why the quorum map displayed on the wall still showed my seat as active, while my body sat against the back credenza. The theatre was almost elegant in its cruelty because every person in that room could tell the difference between process and performance, and every person with rank chose performance. Victor was not done. He turned to security with the confidence of a man who had never had to defend his power on the merits. "Please confirm observer protocol at the rear table," he said, voice carrying through ceiling speakers and into the live record. "No observer commentary, no direct interruption, no submission of motions." The younger of the 2 security officers stepped forward, paused beside my shoulder and spoke quietly enough to preserve everyone's fiction of civility. "Ma'am, we need your badge visible and your microphone disabled." He didn't meet my eyes until the last word, and when he did, I saw apology trying to stay out of uniform. I clipped my badge to the edge of my jacket where the camera could capture it and slid my microphone puck to the center of the table without argument. Across the room, Victor gave a small nod, as if a technical correction had been completed. Then he looked directly at me and delivered the line he would later wish had never been recorded. "This is a governance session, not a drafting workshop. Observe." The phrase pulled a few short breaths from the room, the kind people release through their nose when they are afraid a full exhale will be interpreted as dissent. Somewhere to my left, one of the division heads let out a restrained laugh that died halfway through his throat. It was not humour, it was alignment. I had heard the same register at quarterly reviews when Victor introduced me after my own analysis had carried the briefing. "Taylor keeps us tidy," he would say, and men who could not pass a wrist trigger would smile as though tidiness were a decorative skill rather than the difference between lawful action and regulatory exposure. Tonight he had found a sharper synonym: drafting workshop, support function, back wall. At 6:49 p.m, the red recording light flickered once as the system cycled to a new encrypted segment, then steadied again. The corporate secretary began reading motion language into the record, and Victor interrupted her twice to clarify intent, each clarification broadening emergency authority while narrowing oversight windows. He spoke in compressed legal cadence, good enough to persuade non-lawyers, imprecise enough to shift control if not challenged. "Interim operational directives shall be vested in the chair pending market stabilization metrics," he said. "Certification thresholds may be satisfied by active director majority present." Active director majority present. He used that phrase instead of fixed quorum, because fixed quorum would have forced acknowledgement of the seat he had erased. He was writing exclusion into grammar while everyone listened. I stood when he called for any final procedural objections from recognised participants, because sitting had become an accessory to his narrative. My chair moved against marble with a clean, bright sound that cut through the room harder than any raised voice. "Point of order," I said, projecting without microphone. "Standing must be established under controlling bylaw text before ballot certification." Victor did not even pretend to consult documents. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and gave me the kind of smile that had closed careers in this building without ever leaving fingerprints. "You are out of order," he said, "and out of category." He looked past me to the corporate secretary. "Strike the interruption as non-director observer disruption." Then, to me again, each syllable clipped for the transcript. "Sit down, Taylor. You have no standing in this proceeding." That sentence did what he intended. It branded me in front of directors, auditors, counsel, and compliance cameras as a procedural trespasser, and it offered every silent witness a convenient script for tomorrow morning. She misunderstood her role. She became emotional. She interrupted governance. I felt the first flash of heat at the base of my neck, the old mammalian surge that tells a body to defend itself with volume, with speed, with visible refusal. My hands wanted motion. My voice wanted edge. I gave the room neither. I placed both palms on the walnut, counted one full breath in, one full breath out, and sat with the deliberateness of someone setting evidence in a sealed bag. He moved on immediately, because dominance depends on tempo. "Preliminary ballots," he said. "Pass to secretary." Cards slid forward. The compliance officers logged chain of custody. Adrian Cho remained motionless, eyes on the table, not on Victor, not on me. The neutrality of counsel can feel like abandonment when you are the only person naming a breach in real time. I had learned to read it differently. Neutrality is a locked door until someone uses the correct key. Tonight required keys, not speeches. I opened my notebook to a clean page and began building the record he thought he controlled. 1849-12. Chair directs security to disable observer microphone. 1849-37. Chair states, governance session, not drafting workshop. 1850-21. Chair uses active director majority present formulation. 1850-58. Standing objection, denied without citation. 1851-04. Statement entered. No standing in this proceeding. I wrote in block print, legible for third-party review with no adjectives and no emotional shorthand. Precision is not personality, it is survivability. Across from me, Director Mercer finally looked up. Her face had gone pale under the conference lighting, and for a moment I thought she might speak. 3 years earlier, when a regulator had questioned her committee's disclosure timing, I had spent a weekend rebuilding her chronology so she could answer accurately under oath. She knew exactly what unverified procedure could do to a board. She also knew Victor-controlled committee assignments, travel approvals, and the informal invitations that turned directors into insiders. Her lips parted, then closed. She returned to her packet, and the room kept moving as if silence were a neutral act instead of a vote with no paper trail. Victor requested a show of preliminary assent by raised hand while ballots were still being collected, a symbolic move designed to manufacture inevitability. Hands went up in staggered compliance, some quick, some reluctant, all camera visible. When no hand rose from my corner, he performed surprise. "Noted," he said, glancing in my direction without naming me, "that observers are not counted." A few people shifted. One of the auditors dropped his pen. The sound skittered across stone and came to rest against a brass floor strip, absurdly loud in a room trained to avoid disruption. He retrieved it with shaking fingers. My restraint was not passive. It was tactical sequencing under hostile conditions. I ran the decision tree the same way I had run crisis models during the proxy war. Identify irrevocable event, identify intervention window, preserve challenge path, force independent verification. The irrevocable event was certification, not posturing. The intervention window remained open until counsel affirmed final validity. The challenge path required one uncontestable request anchored to governing text. The independent verifier was Adrian, and Adrian would not move on implication. He would move on documents. Victor began reading his prepared rationale for emergency authority, invoking market turbulence and leadership continuity risk. Each phrase widened his discretion and disguised personal consolidation as institutional necessity. He was good at this. I never underestimated that. He understood rooms, fear, and the lazy comfort of hierarchy. What he did not understand was architecture. He had mistaken authorship for ownership for 9 years. He believed that because he had announced rules, he controlled their meaning. He had forgotten that bylaws do not care who sits at the head of the table. They care what was ratified, what was amended, and what can be proven under record conditions. I felt my pulse settle fully for the first time since he told me to observe. The humiliation remained, sharp and metallic, but it no longer directed my movement. A memory surfaced with clinical clarity. Outside counsel in the proxy war years, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, telling me over cold coffee at 2:13 a.m. The person who wins governance disputes is rarely the loudest person in the room. It is the person who can point to the controlling text before anyone else can find the right binder. I had built my career as if that sentence were a professional oath. Tonight, I treated it as instruction. Victor concluded his rationale and nodded to the corporate secretary for tally preparation. The secretary reached for the ballot tray. I rose again, slowly, without scraping my chair this time. For record integrity, I said, voice level, formal, and stripped to function. Please submit the controlling Article 4 text to Corporate Counsel for verification before vote certification. I did not cite subsection yet. I did not reveal the amendment language. I offered the narrowest lawful request that no prudent board could reject without exposing intent. It was a legal environment now, not a personality contest, and in legal environments the burden shifts the moment verification is formally invoked. Victor's expression hardened at the edges. Not anger first, but calculation. He looked at Adrian as if expecting reflexive deference. Counsel has reviewed the packet, he said. We will not delay for theatrics. Adrian lifted his gaze finally, and the room adjusted around that movement the way iron filings align around a magnet. He did not look at Victor. He looked at me. Ms. Bennett, he said, careful, neutral, audible to the microphones, are you requesting verification against the current digital summary or the ratified registry text? The question landed like a latch clicking open. Victor started to answer for him. Adrian raised one hand, polite and absolute. I asked Ms. Bennett. The room changed temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. Directors who had been staring at their packets now watched counsel. The compliance officer nearest the door stepped closer to the recording console and checked timestamp sync again. Victor's allies stopped performing confidence and began performing stillness. I felt the same heat in my neck as before, but this time it did not signal humiliation. It signaled timing. Ratified registry text, I said, including post-proxy amendments and handwritten counsel annotations retained in records custody. My tone remained even. My hands remained at my sides. Outburst would have made me legible to Victor's narrative. Precision made me legible to the law. For a beat, no one spoke. Then Adrian said, Understood. Certification is paused pending verification. He turned to the corporate secretary. Please mark the record accordingly. Victor's jaw tightened so hard the muscle jumped once near his ear. He leaned toward his microphone and gave a short laugh meant to sound dismissive. On what basis are we indulging archival scavenger hunts during an emergency? Adrian did not answer him immediately. He pressed his intercom key and addressed records in the same tone he might use for a routine filing request. Records, this is Corporate Counsel. Bring the Article 4 ratification binder and amendment ledger to Conference Hall A priority. He released the key, looked back at the table and added, Until then, no vote may be certified. The microphones stayed live, and the quiet that followed had weight to it, a procedural silence rather than a peaceful one, the kind that forms when everyone in a room realizes the script has stopped moving forward and no one knows who will be asked to improvise on record. Victor kept one hand on the edge of his packet, thumb tapping a measured rhythm against cardstock, while the corporate secretary annotated the pause with careful keystrokes. I remained standing for a moment longer, then sat only after the secretary read, Certification paused, pending registry verification, into the minutes. The words were neutral. The air was not. From the back of the hall, glass reflected brass and fluorescent bands across the marble floor, turning the room into a grid of hard lines and controlled faces. I had lived inside those lines for 9 years. Victor leaned toward his microphone as if resuming command by posture alone. "Let the record reflect that delay risk now increases materially," he said. "We are managing a live external pressure event, and this detour is administrative." He didn't look at me when he said detour. He looked at the directors who still took cues from his breathing. "I expect focus from voting members." His allies answered with nods that were almost too quick to look voluntary. One of them, Director Mills, adjusted his cufflinks and added, "We should avoid procedural theatrics." He spoke with the confidence of a man who had never once drafted the procedure he cited. I wrote his sentence down next to the timecode. Adrian did not rise to the bait. "The board is protected by verification," he said, calm and spare, "not endangered by it." Then he turned one page in his folder and waited. The restraint in that one motion pulled me backward through years of rooms where I had been asked for certainty and then erased from the certainty once it worked. I could still see the old war room from the acquisition fight, whiteboards layered 3 deep with decision trees, legal pads stacked against thermal coffee carafes, outside counsel speaking in clipped triage questions, while executives cycled through for briefings they would later describe as leadership instinct. At 1:40 a.m. on the third night, I had handed Victor a continuity matrix that solved a signature bottleneck across 3 subsidiaries. He had scanned it, underlined one heading, and said, "Good, I can use this." The next morning, he presented the model to the chair as our emergency framework, and no one asked what our meant. He had refined that method until it became culture. In my second year under him, after I rebuilt an audit response on 12 hours' notice and kept a penalty finding off the quarterly filing, he called me into his office with the door half open, a management tactic designed to make correction feel public without witnesses. "You are excellent," he said, looking at my memo, not at me. "But excellence in your lane. Do not create cross-functional confusion by speaking before directors unless invited." I asked whether he wanted me to route all governance clarifications through his chief of staff for consistency. He smiled as if I had proven his point. "I want you to remember, visibility is not the same as value." He repeated that line at least 6 times over the next 3 years in slightly different language, each version cleaner, more deniable, more effective. By the second week of November, 3 years later, after a restructuring cycle that cut 2 of my analysts and doubled my review load, he started introducing me to external visitors as our technical backbone, always with a light hand at the centre of my back guiding me out of frame before photos. Technical backbone sounded complimentary until you noticed who got named as strategy, who got seated near the chair, who got quoted in recap emails. I remember one investor dinner in particular because the silverware had been set with ceremonial precision and the room smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish. I had prepared the governance risk appendix that answered the only questions those investors actually cared about. Victor toasted our leadership bench and named 4 men in sequence, including 1 vice president. I had trained that quarter on how to read a compensation trigger. He lifted his glass toward me without saying my name. "And thank you to support operations for keeping the machine clean." The table laughed politely. I learned then that humiliation can be formal, fully dressed, and still leave bruises no camera captures. Tonight carried the same anatomy, just without disguise. The back wall seat, the observer packet, the microphone disablement, the line on standing. Invalidation was never one dramatic incident. It was administrative weather, constant enough to make people call it climate. I watched Director Mercer trace the edge of her ballot with one finger, then fold her hands to stop the motion. I remembered her office 2 years earlier, blinds half closed, when she had whispered, "Can you explain the indemnification language before tomorrow? Victor says it's routine, but I cannot tell what it transfers." I had spent 90 minutes walking her through definitions with examples, mapping liability paths on a yellow legal pad, while she took notes as if studying for an exam. At the end, she had said, "I trust your read." The next day, in committee, she credited Victor for clarifying complexities. She met my eyes once across the table, then looked away. At 7:03 p.m, the recording lights cycled again, red to dark to red, segmenting the archive into another encrypted file. The pause stretched long enough for people to become restless in ways they could not admit. Someone at audit asked for water and did not drink it. The younger security officer shifted his weight from heel to toe, eyes fixed on a point above the wall clock. Victor used the delay to retake narrative space in increments. "Since we are waiting on archives," he said, "let us ensure role clarity." He addressed the room, but the sentence was aimed at me. Draft contributors are not automatically governance principles. A few heads turned in my direction. None stayed there long. I felt heat rise in my throat, then settle. He was still trying to recast authorship as clerical service because that framing had kept him safe for years. I let myself remember one more scene. Not to dwell, but to anchor. It was 5 years ago, a board retreat at a coastal conference centre where the wind rattled the glass at night and everyone wore informal clothes to simulate candour. The second day, a director asked why our continuity controls had outperformed peers during a sector disruption. Victor answered for 12 minutes with executive vocabulary polished smooth by repetition. When he finished, the same director asked, "Who built the trigger hierarchy?" Victor glanced at me and said, "It emerged through team process." After lunch, he found me near the service corridor where staff carts rattled over tile and told me, "Do not personalize institutional work." Then, softer, with the practice concern he used when he wanted compliance without conflict, "You are most effective when you stay procedural." I had nodded because I needed my staff protected and my projects funded. Silence wasn't humility, it was rent. The intercom beside the secretary clicked. A voice from records announced, "Custody transfer en route. 2 minutes." Adrian acknowledged receipt and asked compliance to log physical chain of custody at the door. Victor exhaled once through his nose, short and visible, then arranged his face back into composure. "Fine," he said. "Let us complete this quickly." He reached for his pen and did not write anything. The directors mirrored him, looking busy in the way frightened people do when they suspect a hierarchy may fail them in public. Across the hall, reflected city lights sharpened against the darkened glass. Inside, every sound became specific. The faint hum of ventilation, the soft click as a compliance officer unlocked a transport case, the rustle of legal paper that had not yet decided whom it served. The door opened, and Marianne Cole entered, carrying a sealed archival folder against her chest like it had weight beyond paper. She had worked records longer than most of this board had held titles. She moved with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that, in institutions, endurance often outranks charisma. Her grey hair was pinned at the nape, her ID lanyard straight, her expression neutral in the way only veteran staff can manage when they know more than they are paid to say. She did not glance toward Victor first. She went directly to compliance, presented the custody form, waited for timestamp confirmation, and only then stepped toward Counsel. The folder was thick, dark blue, with embossed registry numbering and an older corporate seal we had retired after the proxy war. Seeing that seal on the table was like seeing a prior version of the company return to testify. Article 4, Ratification Binder, Amendment Ledger, and Contemporaneous Minutes, Marianne said. Her voice carried without strain. Includes physical annotations by prior corporate counsel as retained under records policy. Adrian accepted the folder, but before he opened it, Marianne turned slightly and met my eyes for the briefest second. No smile, no theatrics, just recognition between people who had stayed late in the same fluorescent corridors while others took credit in brighter rooms. Then she placed one additional item beside my water glass, a slim, sealed envelope with records tape across the flap and my name printed in block letters. Taylor Bennett. The handwriting was hers. Victor noticed the envelope immediately. "What is that?" he said, sharper than he intended. "And why is it being distributed mid-session?" Marianne did not flinch. "Supplemental custody item indexed to this proceeding," she replied. "Logged at intake." She handed the custody sheet to the corporate secretary, who scanned it, swallowed, and read aloud. Item C, Certified Extract Packet, Section 4.3, Amendment History. Prepared for counsel review and participant notice. Participant notice, not observer. The words sat in the room like a struck bell. Adrian opened the main folder with careful hands and began cross-checking tabs against the digital summary on his screen. The room watched him work because no one could command around him now. Each page turn sounded loud enough to mark a heartbeat. He paused at the amendment ledger, traced one line with his finger, then looked to the secretary. Please project the current summary deck language for Article 4, Section 4.3. The deck appeared on the wall, clean and condensed, a modernized bullet summary that treated standing as board seat dependent during emergency motions. Adrian said, "Now hold." He lifted the physical ledger. "Registry text differs." Victor leaned forward. "Counsel, summaries are operational tools. We cannot govern off marginalia from a prior era." Adrian did not look up. "Ratified text governs. Summaries do not supersede it." My hands were steady when I broke the records tape on the envelope. Inside were 3 certified copies and 1 original memo on old legal stationery, edges yellowed but preserved. The first copy was the full amendment language adopted after the proxy war, including continuity controls for leadership challenge motions. The second was the attendance page with signatures, mine included as drafting architect and designated continuity officer. The third was a certification note from external counsel confirming automatic standing for that role when emergency authority touched chair powers. The original memo was handwritten by former counsel in blue ink across the margin of a board minute. If chair authority is subject of motion, continuity architect vote is mandatory for certification integrity. I remembered the night he wrote it, remembered him pushing the minute book toward me and saying, "People forget why we draft safeguards. Paper remembers." Marianne spoke quietly enough that only I and the nearest microphone caught it. "Section 4.3 was amended after the proxy war," she said. "They never updated the summary deck." Then she stepped back to the wall and folded her hands, witness position, no drama. I placed the certified extract on the table edge within camera view and slid 1 copy toward Adrian without standing. Victor's face had changed by degrees over the past minute, colour draining first at the temples, then across the mouth. He was still upright, still composed to an untrained eye, but the performance had started to crack at the seams. Director Mills stopped touching his cufflinks. Mercer stared at the projected summary as if seeing it for the first time. Raj Patel finally looked directly at me and did not look away. Adrian compared the certification seals, checked registry numbers, and asked compliance to zoom the camera on the signature page for the record. The red light reflected off the plastic sleeve over the old minutes, making the signatures gleam briefly as if newly inked. Victor tried once more. "Counsel, we are losing critical time." Adrian answered with courtroom clarity, each word set down like a brick. "We are recovering, controlling authority." He placed the ledger flat, turned to the secretary and said, "Prepare to amend participant status, pending final verbal ruling." The secretary's fingers hovered above her keyboard, waiting. I could hear my own breathing, slow and deliberate, and beyond it, the faint hum of the building that had taught me to shrink in order to stay employed. I touched the edge of the old memo once, just enough to feel the indentation of handwriting through paper. Symbol, proof, memory, standing. The same room, different record. Adrian's fingers rested on the open ledger, and for one suspended beat, the room seemed willing to let the paper speak. Victor did not. He leaned toward his microphone with the controlled impatience of a man reclaiming cadence and said, "Given the emergence of legacy materials with unclear interpretive status, I move we enter executive subsession for directors and counsel only." He paused, then added, "All non-director personnel, including support contributors and record staff, will clear the table during deliberation." The phrase support contributors was precise in its cruelty. He had just watched my signature appear on a ratified attendance page, and he still reached for the old hierarchy as if language alone could put me back against the wall. The corporate secretary looked at Adrian, not Victor. Victor noticed, and the muscle in his jaw tightened again. "Secretary, mark the motion," he said. "Immediate closed review." Marianne stood near the wall with her hands folded, gaze level, her posture the kind built over decades of being underestimated by executives who confused quiet with permission. She didn't move toward the door. Neither did I. I kept one hand on the certified extract and one on my notebook because I had learned that documents left unattended in contested rooms develop new biographies. Director Mills cleared his throat. "That seems prudent," he said quickly, performing reasonableness for the cameras. "We should avoid procedural contamination." He did not define contamination. He did not have to. In this building, contamination often meant a woman with receipts speaking in full sentences. Raj Patel shifted forward in his chair, glanced at the projected summary deck, then at the physical ledger, then down again. Mercer's pen hovered over her packet without touching it. Silence rolled through the horseshoe in small private calculations, committee assignments, reputational exposure, who would still return calls if Victor kept the chair. Adrian lifted his head and spoke before the secretary could type. Executive sub-session cannot be used to exclude a participant whose standing is the subject of the verification itself. He kept his tone neutral, neither confrontational nor deferential. We will complete threshold determination on record. Victor smiled, a thin expression with no warmth. Counsel, we are not trying standing in court. We are preserving governance efficiency. Adrian closed one tab in the binder and opened another. Governance efficiency without lawful standing is unenforceable theatre, he said. I advise against it. Victor did not like being corrected in nouns he could not spin. He turned his head towards security. Please prepare to clear non-director positions if called. The younger officer looked at the older one first, then gave a small, reluctant nod. I heard the message for what it was, one more public attempt to frame me as removable furniture, while the deciding text sat open in front of them. The old reflex arrived, familiar and expensive, urging me to minimize, to reassure, to make myself administratively small so men with titles could feel procedurally large. I did not feed it. I sat straighter, slid my badge fully into camera view, and spoke into the live microphones with measured diction. For record integrity, I object to any exclusion motion prior to standing determination under ratified text. Victor swung his gaze to me as if I had breached decorum by conjugating a verb. You do not object, he said. Observers do not object. He looked to the secretary again. Strike her statement. The secretary's fingers stayed frozen above the keyboard. Adrian intervened without raising his voice. Do not strike. Mark as pending participant status dispute statement. Then he looked at me directly. Ms. Bennett, please keep your documents visible to compliance camera. It was a small instruction, but in rooms like this, small instructions are jurisdiction. I angled the certified copy under the overhead lens until the seal and registry number were centered. At 7:11 p.m., 9 minutes after certification had been paused, the compliance officer at the console read out a timestamp sync and confirmed visual capture of Item C, signature page, and amendment note. Victor exhaled sharply. We are now narrating stationery for the archive while market exposure escalates, he said. This is exactly why strategic authority cannot be hostage to drafting technicians. There it was again. Not an argument, but a social demotion disguised as operational concern. Drafting technicians. He wanted the directors to hear it and return to the comfort of old labels. He wanted me coded as labour, not governance. I remembered the year he had changed my internal title during restructuring from governance architect to governance support lead for org simplicity, then congratulated me in public for embracing non-egoic leadership. Titles had always been his preferred weapon because people rarely challenge what appears in HR systems. I answered him with one line. The amendment was ratified by this board and governs this motion regardless of preferred vocabulary. No tremor, no heat, just text. Mills turned to Mercer and murmured, not quite quietly enough, we cannot let process specialists hijack emergency mandate. Mercer did not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the attendance page, on the older seal, on my signature adjacent to the continuity designation she had pretended for years not to remember. Victor seized the whisper as permission. Precisely, he said. Counsel, confirm whether this so-called continuity role even exists in current governance architecture. He said so-called with polished skepticism, the tone executives use when they want to make history sound anecdotal. Adrian did not rush. He set the digital summary beside the physical registry, aligned page numbers, and then spoke to compliance. Please project the ratified language from Section 4.3 subsection D exactly as written. The screen changed from simplified bullets to a scanned page in dense legal prose, signatures ghosting at the margin where ink had pressed through. The typography looked older, less polished, less marketable than the deck version. It also looked like law. Adrian read aloud, each phrase clipped for transcript precision. In any motion materially altering chair authority under emergent conditions, standing shall include all seated directors and designated continuity architect of record, whose vote is mandatory for certification validity. The last clause moved through the room like a pressure drop. Mandatory for certification validity. Victor spoke over the final word. That designation sunset when governance was modernized. Adrian held up a hand. Show me the sunset clause. Victor opened his packet, flipped pages, found nothing, flipped faster. Mills reached for his own annex, then stopped when he remembered the observer packet disparity and realized half the room didn't even have the same documents. Raj looked up at last and said carefully, I do not have any sunset language in my packet. Mercer added, almost to herself, neither do I. Victor's face lost another degree of colour. Because the summary superseded legacy drafting in practice, he said. Everyone here understands that. Adrian's voice remained flat. Practice cannot supersede ratification without subsequent ratification. He turned to Marianne. Miss Cole, records custody confirmation. Was any rescission or replacement of subsection D ever entered? Marianne answered without flourish. No rescission filed, no replacement filed. Annual summaries were updated for brevity only. She paused. Brevity omitted standing language. The word omitted carried more force than accusation. Omitted could be negligence, convenience, or design. In governance disputes, motive matters less than artifact, but motive still colours faces. Several directors looked down at their summary decks as if seeing them as edited documents instead of truth. Victor noticed the drift and tried to slam the frame shut. This is exactly why summaries exist, he said, to keep us operational, not trapped in archival ambiguity. Adrian responded, there is no ambiguity in the sentence, mandatory for certification validity. The older security officer stepped closer to Victor and whispered something at his shoulder, likely a protocol reminder about removing personnel during active legal review. Victor gave a clipped nod and waved him back with irritation he could not fully hide. Then he pointed at the envelope copies near my hand. Those materials were prepared outside legal chain and handed directly to a disputed attendee. That alone should disqualify them. Marianne's chin lifted by a fraction. Incorrect, she said. Item C was logged at intake, sealed under records custody, released in room on counsel instruction path, camera captured. She looked to compliance. Please confirm. The compliance officer spoke into his mic. Confirmed. I felt my pulse in my wrists, but not in my voice. Counsel requested participant notice, I said. The custody sheet reflects that language. The secretary nodded faintly, eyes still on her screen. Victor's control had always depended on everyone else accepting his definitions before checking their source. Tonight, his definitions kept colliding with forms, logs, seals, and signatures. None of those cared about charisma. By 7:16 p.m., the room had moved from social hierarchy to evidentiary hierarchy, and the transition was visible in posture alone. Adrian requested the minute book that corresponded to the annotation memo. Marianne provided it from the folder, gloved hands careful at the page edges. He verified registry stamps, then handed the book to the secretary for independent visual confirmation. Read the margin annotation into record, he said. The secretary swallowed, adjusted her microphone, and read, if chair authority is subject of motion, continuity architect vote is mandatory for certification integrity. Her voice shook on architect and steadied on integrity, as if she understood in real time which word would survive review. Victor leaned back and gave a short laugh that did not reach anyone. A margin note by former counsel is not operative law. Adrian nodded once. Correct by itself. Operative force comes from the ratified subsection. The note confirms contemporaneous interpretation. He turned a page. An interpretation was accepted in board minutes 3 lines below, unanimously. He angled the book toward the camera and read the acceptance line. No one challenged him. The slight returned one final time, harder because he had fewer options left. Victor looked directly at me and said, even if a historical drafting role existed, Ms. Bennett abandoned any claim by accepting non-director classification for years. Standing can be waived by conduct. It was a legal-sounding argument, and for a beat, I could see two directors reach for it as an escape hatch. Adrian closed that hatch before it opened. "Not in this context," he said. "Mandatory certification conditions are structural, not personal entitlements. They cannot be waived by social custom, title drift, or chair preference." He shifted his gaze to the whole board now, no longer just Victor. "Any certification that excludes a mandatory vote is voidable on immediate challenge." The recognition arrived not with volume, but with grammar. Adrian placed both hands on the table, looked at Victor, and delivered the ruling with courtroom clarity that left no rhetorical room to hide inside. Chair Hale, under Article 4, Section 4.3, as amended and ratified, Ms. Taylor Bennett has full standing and a mandatory vote in this proceeding. Excluding her invalidates certification and exposes this board to immediate governance challenge. The sentence hung in the microphones for a second, then settled into the archive as fact. No one moved right away. Victor's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Mills stared at his packet as if it might offer a late amendment to reality. Mercer released a breath she had been holding for half an hour, and finally looked at me directly. Not with apology exactly, but with the recognition of someone watching a private myth collapse in public light. Raj sat back, shoulders lowering, and gave the smallest nod, less to me than to the text now occupying the centre of the room. Adrian continued, procedural to the end. "Secretary. Restore Ms. Bennett to participant role. Compliance, annotate standing determination at current timestamp. Security. No removal actions regarding Ms. Bennett. Records. Retain all materials under litigation hold protocol pending close." Each instruction clicked into place like lockpins aligning. The younger officer, who had disabled my microphone earlier, stepped forward, unclipped the mute cap, and reactivated the channel at my seat without speaking. He set the live indicator to green and stepped back to his post. The secretary rose, crossed the marble, and lifted my nameplate from the back credenza, where it had spent the evening pretending I was optional. She carried it to the voting arc and placed it between Mercer and Raj with both hands, careful not to scrape the walnut. Brass letters caught the fluorescent light. Taylor Bennett. She returned to her chair and read into the record. Voice formal now. "Participant status corrected pursuant to counsel determination." I did not smile. Vindication in rooms like this is rarely cinematic. It is administrative and exact. I moved from the back seat to the restored position, set my notebook beside the ballot area, and aligned the certified extract with the edge of the table. Victor watched me sit in the chair he had tried to erase, and for the first time in 9 years he looked less like a chairman, and more like a man discovering that procedure is loyal only to those who can prove it. The room had not become kind, it had become accurate. It had. Accuracy changed the geometry of the table faster than argument ever had. Victor still occupied the chair at the head, but he no longer occupied the room. Adrian turned one page, tapped the margin with his pen, and said, "We return to pending business under corrected participant role. All preliminary actions taken after improper exclusion are non-certifiable and must be retaken." The secretary repeated him into the microphones, each word clipped for permanence. "Prior preliminary ballot intake is struck. Prior show of hands indication is struck. Session reverts to pre-certification posture." She looked at me, then at the tray. "Ms. Bennett, ballot issued." A compliance officer stepped forward with a fresh card, white stock with a blue security thread visible along the edge. He placed it in front of me the same way he had placed cards for directors for years, and the ordinariness of the gesture landed harder than any apology could have. Victor reached for his microphone. "This is procedural overcorrection," he said. "The board's intent has already been demonstrated." Adrian did not raise his voice. "Intent is not certification." He nodded to the secretary. "Read the motion exactly as entered, without interpretive gloss." She did. And for the first time that evening, the language sounded smaller than Victor's performance had made it. Emergency concentration of chair authority pending undefined stabilization metrics, reduced oversight windows, discretionary threshold interpretation delegated to chair office. I listened without expression, though I felt every prior year lined up behind that sentence like witnesses waiting outside a hearing room. Every photo I had been guided out of, every briefing credit reassigned, every excellent with details delivered as praise and placement. This motion was the distilled form of all of it. Not a crisis response, but an architecture for unilateral control dressed in institutional concern. I wrote one line in my notebook: control attempts always arrive as temporary necessities. Ballots now, the secretary said. Cardstock moved around the arc. Mercer marked hers quickly and turned it face down, then pressed her fingertips against the table as if to stop a tremor. Raj read the motion text twice before writing, deliberate, jaw set. Mills checked Victor's face first and then his own card, the reflex of a man accustomed to voting by atmosphere. I marked mine in one stroke, folded once, and slid it forward. No flourish, no pause for effect, just ink, paper, chain of custody. At 7:19 p.m., less than 3 minutes after my nameplate returned to the voting arc, the retaken ballots were collected in full camera view. The secretary counted with compliance, observing each card transfer. 9 issued, 9 returned, she said. She unfolded the first card, then the second, reading totals only after all 9 were tabulated. Her voice steadied as she reached the end. On the motion for emergency chair authority expansion, 4 in favour, 5 opposed. Motion fails. The sentence struck the room cleanly. Not dramatic, not loud. Final. Victor's proposal did not collapse under rhetoric. It collapsed under count integrity. He leaned forward, palms flat, and tried to reopen what had just closed. Record my objection to the validity of this tally given contamination by disputed status reversal. Adrian answered without looking up from the ledger. Objection recorded. Overruled on controlling text already entered. Victor turned to the directors with a brittle smile. You are voting against continuity in a live threat environment. Raj spoke before anyone else could adopt the framing. We are voting against unauthorized concentration of authority. Continuity requires lawful process. He kept his eyes on Victor for the full sentence, then looked to the secretary. I request immediate follow-on motion. Victor cut in. Out of sequence. Adrian said, in sequence. A failed emergency authority motion during active governance dispute permits censure consideration. Mills shifted, startled. Censure is disproportionate. Mercer's voice arrived low and precise. Excluding a mandatory vote and attempting certification anyway is not a clerical error. She looked at the minute screen, then at Victor. It is a fiduciary breach risk. The secretary asked. State motion language. Raj did not hedge. I move that the board issue formal censure of Chair Victor Hale for procedural misconduct, suspend him from chair functions pending independent fiduciary review, and transfer interim chair duties to Vice Chair Mercer under existing charter limits. The room seemed to inhale at once. Victor barked a short laugh that sounded more like strain than disbelief. This is opportunism. Raj replied, This is governance. Second, Mercer said. Victor turned toward her slowly, as if the movement itself could restore influence. Elaine, be very careful. She held his gaze and answered, I have been careful for too long. It was the first openly disloyal sentence anyone had spoken to him all evening, and it altered the perimeter more than my restored seat had. The silent enablers were beginning to choose preservation over allegiance. Adrian addressed the table. Motion is properly entered and seconded. Discussion limited to conduct relevant to fiduciary obligations and procedural integrity. Victor began speaking over him. Adrian continued at the same volume, and Victor stopped mid-phrase. The secretary logged timestamps, eyes fixed on her screen. I could see the pulse in her throat from where I sat. Mills made the first defense, hands clasped too tightly. We are conflating documentation disputes with leadership intent. Chair Hale acted under pressure to protect enterprise value. Mercer answered without heat. Intent does not erase exclusion of mandatory standing after explicit objection. She turned one page in her packet. He directed minutes to characterize that objection as observer disruption. That instruction is in the record. Raj added, he attempted executive sub-session exclusion during threshold verification. Also in record. Adrian confirmed. Correct. Victor tried another lane. The summary deck omitted legacy text. That is a systems failure, not misconduct. I spoke then. because the line crossed directly through my years. The summary decommission did not instruct security to disable my microphone. The summary decommission did not move my nameplate to the wall. The summary decommission did not produce the sentence, "You have no standing. Observe. Don't participate." Those were choices. I stopped there. I did not need more. Evidence is strongest when it ends before emotion asks to continue. No one contradicted me. Even Mills looked down. The secretary called for the censure vote. Cards were issued again, this time with hands that moved less confidently. Victor did not touch his card immediately. He stared at the white rectangle as if it were a document in an unfamiliar language, then marked it with a hard downward stroke that tore the surface fibre. Compliance collected the ballots in silence. The hum of ventilation seemed louder now, the building itself filling the space where his authority had been. On the motion for formal censure and suspension of chair functions pending fiduciary review, the secretary read, 6 in favour, 3 opposed. Motion passes. The destabilization was visible before anyone said another word. Colour drained from Victor's face in a slow, unmistakable wash. His mouth tightened, then slackened, then tightened again as if he were testing arguments that no longer held shape. Mills reached for his water glass and misjudged the distance, fingers striking the base hard enough to spill across his packet. He stood halfway to contain it, sat again, and dabbed at paper already ruined. Another ally, Director Klein, who had echoed Victor in every major vote for 2 years, removed his glasses and cleaned lenses that were not smudged, buying seconds he could not use. Adrian began post-vote directives with the same tone he had used all night, which now felt like mercy because it refused spectacle. Effective immediately under passed motion. Chair functions are suspended. Vice Chair Mercer assumes procedural control for this session only, subject to charter limits. Independent review notice will be drafted tonight. He looked to compliance. Preserve full audio-visual record, all packet versions and custody logs under litigation hold protocol. To records. Ms. Cole, retain original registry materials in secured archive with restricted access list. Marianne nodded once. Already prepared. Victor finally found volume. You are making a severe mistake based on archival technicalities and personal grievance. Mercer answered as acting chair, and her first sentence carried the authority she had deferred for years. This board is correcting a severe mistake made in real time on live record under your direction. She turned to the secretary. Enter that statement. The secretary typed immediately. He looked at me then, not as furniture, not as support, but as a threat he had misclassified for too long. There was anger in it, and something thinner beneath the anger, disbelief that documentation he had treated as scenery had become jurisdiction. He opened his mouth as if to deliver one final diminishment, then stopped when 2 compliance officers approached the head of the table with a small lock case and an access termination form. The older officer spoke with formal restraint. Mr. Hale, pursuant to past board motion and counsel instruction, we need your building badge, executive floor token, and board portal authentication key. The request was procedural, practiced, almost gentle. Victor stared at him, then at the form, then at the directors who had once moved when he lifted a hand. No one intervened. Mills kept blotting water from his packet. Klein studied the grain of the walnut table as if it contained legal guidance. Raj sat very still, hands folded. Mercer did not look away. Victor placed his badge on the table first, then the token, each contact with wood producing a small, hard click that the microphones captured with merciless clarity. The authentication key followed a beat later. He pushed all 3 items toward the lock case without touching the officer's hand. Entered under protest, he said, but the phrase lacked force now, reduced to ritual. Protest noted, Adrian replied. The officers sealed the case, logged time and item numbers, and stepped back. Victor remained seated for a moment after surrendering access, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. The room that had echoed his banter for years gave him no language to stand on. Administrative silence settled in layers. Keyboards, ventilation, the soft shiver of paper as people reordered packets no one could pretend were ordinary anymore. I looked at the brass letters of my restored nameplate, then at the minute screen where the correction trail now sat in chronological order. Exclusion, objection, verification, standing restored. Motion failed, censure passed, access surrendered. Not triumph, Accuracy. The same institution, the same fluorescent light, the same marble and walnut. Different center of gravity. Mercer called the next procedural item with a voice that still carried strain but no longer carried fear. Adrian began outlining review parameters. Marianne gathered duplicate seals for transport. Around me, people adjusted to a hierarchy no longer enforced by habit. Victor did not speak again. His allies avoided each other's eyes, pale and suddenly formal, as if they had woken inside a company they did not recognize because, for one night, the bylaws were allowed to mean what they said. Mercer called the room back to order with both palms on the table, the way people do when they are holding themselves steady as much as they are directing others. "We will complete corrective actions now," she said. "No one leaves until the record is closed, custody is logged, and participant status corrections are certified." Her voice still carried strain, but fear had left it. Adrian nodded once and began dictating sequence to the secretary. Corrected roll call, voided preliminary tally, standing determination text, failed authority motion, passed censure motion, access surrender log. The secretary repeated each item, and with every repetition, the evening moved from spectacle into documentation, where power does not survive without paper. Victor remained seated at the head for another 30 seconds, then pushed his chair back with a hard scrape that bounced off marble and glass. "You have your theatre," he said, looking at no one and everyone. "Do not confuse this with leadership." Mercer answered without raising her tone. "Mr. Hale, your protest is entered. You are now non-presiding and non-voting pending review status. Please move to observer position or exit with compliance." He stared at her, then at Adrian, then at me. The look he gave me was the same one he had used for years after meetings when he wanted me to absorb blame in private and keep his image intact in public. It no longer had jurisdiction. The older compliance officer opened the lock case again, verified badge, token, and authentication key against the form, then sealed it with a numbered strip and read the seal number into the microphones. The younger officer, the one who had disabled my microphone earlier, stepped to my left and placed a small evidence card by my notebook. "Microphone status corrected, recorded at 1923, he said, formal and careful. He met my eyes for a moment and added, quieter, "I should have asked for counsel before I touched your channel." I gave him the only answer that fit the room. "You corrected it on record. That matters?" He nodded and returned to the wall. At 7:24 p.m., while fluorescent light reflected off the old corporate seal in Adrian's binder, the secretary conducted corrected roll call by full title. Vice Chair Elaine Mercer, present and presiding. Director Raj Patel, present. Director Andrew Mills, present. She continued around the arc, then paused at me. Continuity Architect of Record Taylor Bennett, present with mandatory standing under Article 4, Section 4.3, Subsection D. She did not rush the language. No one interrupted it. I answered, "Present." The red recording light stayed solid this time. No flicker, no segment shift, as if even the machinery had decided to stop blinking. Mercer requested brief statements on procedural observations from each voting participant. It was not required, but it was smart. Silence had protected too many people for too long. Raj spoke first. "I observed packet disparities before initial ballot intake and did not raise them. That omission was mine." Mercer followed, looking directly at the minute screen as she spoke. "I recognized Ms. Bennett's nameplate relocation before session start and treated it as administrative. I was wrong." Mills adjusted his wet packet, now wrinkled from spilled water, and kept his eyes lowered. "I relied on summary materials and did not verify ratified text. I accept that failure." One by one, they put their restraint into language. None of it repaired the years. It did end the fiction that no one had noticed. When it reached the division heads and observers, most offered clipped confirmations of what they had seen. Security verification directed only at me. Microphone disablement. Standing objection denied without citation. The auditor who had dropped his pen cleared his throat twice before speaking. I heard the instruction to strike Ms. Bennett's objection as observer disruption. I did not challenge it. His hand shook again when he set his glasses down. The division head who had released that restrained laugh earlier in the night said nothing even when Mercer asked if he had a statement for record clarification. He looked at Victor, then at the table, and shook his head. I marked it privately. One loaded reaction that never became truth, noted as silence. Adrian moved to evidence accounting. All physical items introduced tonight will be logged to disposition now. Marianne stepped forward with custody forms and read each item with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting institutions from their own selective memory. Article 4, Ratification Binder returned to secured archive. Amendment Ledger returned. Minute book scanned, resealed, archived. Item C, certified extract copies. One retained in legal file, one in board file, one in records vault. Original annotation memo returned to archive sleeve under restricted access. Voided preliminary ballots sealed and retained. Corrected ballots sealed and retained. Observer packet with missing annex pages preserved for discrepancy analysis. Lock case with surrendered access credentials transferred to compliance safe pending HR deactivation protocol. Nothing was left floating. Nothing was left to recollection. External reports were handled live, not promised for later. Adrian dictated a governance incident notice to legal operations while the microphones captured his wording. The corporate secretary sent the certified minutes draft to all directors with read receipts enabled and projected the delivery confirmations as they came in, one by one, green check marks appearing beside names that had ignored me for years. Compliance transmitted litigation hold instructions to records, IT, and security. Each department replied with acknowledgement codes on the shared screen. Records confirmed camera segment integrity for 1842 through adjournment with no data loss. IT confirmed executive portal key revocation for Victor's account at 1931 and posted the revocation hash in the log. Every call and instruction that had shaped the night returned with an outcome. Victor stood near the side credenza while this unfolded, one hand resting on the wood where my nameplate had sat at the start of the meeting. He tried once to re-enter the centre. "I request immediate reconsideration of censure pending full review," he said. Adrian answered, "Request denied for tonight under past motion. You may submit written response by 9 a.m. tomorrow for inclusion in review packet." Victor's jaw tightened. "You are all making this company weaker." Mercer replied, "This company is weaker when bylaws are treated as optional." She did not look away. The officers waited. After a long pause, Victor picked up his coat, left his packet behind and walked out between compliance and security without another word. The door closed softly behind him and no one rushed to fill the sound. Mercer resumed agenda control and moved the board through 2 final votes while the room still held the discipline of consequence. First, adoption of corrected minutes and incident appendices, unanimous. Second, interim chair designation under charter vacancy clause until independent review closes, passed 7-2. Mills voted in favour this time, voice barely audible when called. Raj requested an additional motion that the continuity architect designation be restored in active governance rosters and reflected in future packet distribution controls. Second, Mercer said immediately. The motion passed 8-1. The one opposing vote came from Klein, who offered no explanation. The secretary entered the count without commentary. By 8:02 p.m., after the last vote and final readback, Mercer adjourned the emergency session and instructed all participants to remain seated during evidence transfer. Chairs shifted in tired, careful sounds. No one made small talk. Marianne and compliance moved item by item, seal by seal. When she reached me, Marianne held out a signature pad for the chain of custody, close on my temporary document possession. Ms. Bennett, confirm transfer of item C legal copy to counsel file and board file copy to secretary. I signed full name and title. She glanced at the line and gave a brief nod that carried more respect than any speech in that room. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "I kept that annotation sleeve in restricted storage for 9 years because I thought this night might come." I answered, "You kept the company honest long enough for the company to remember how." The room thinned in controlled departures. Raj paused at my chair before leaving. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "I chose timing over courage until counsel forced the threshold." He didn't ask absolution. I gave him what truth allowed. "You spoke when it counted for the vote and for the record. Next time, speak before someone has to bleed for procedure." He accepted that with a short nod. Mercer came last, folder in hand, exhaustion showing at the corners of her eyes. "I saw the nameplate move before 6:40, she said. I told myself it was temporary staging. Her mouth tightened. I knew better. I closed my notebook. So did I every time I stayed quiet to stay employable. We both have new minutes now. When the hall finally emptied, I remained for 1 minute alone at the voting arc. The walnut still held the warmth of hands that had tried to erase me, then had to read my title into record. The brass letters on my nameplate caught the fluorescent bands in thin gold lines. I could hear distant elevator chimes through the glass and the muted hum of a city that would never know how close governance comes to collapse when everyone mistakes confidence for law. I touched the edge of the corrected minutes packet, then the cover of my notebook where Victor's line was time-stamped in block print. I had entered that room as an administrative convenience and left as controlling text. Silence wasn't peace. It was a cost I once paid to remain employable, and this was the night I stopped paying it. My name is Taylor Bennett. My standing was never granted by him. When the record was corrected, so was the room.